welcome once again to the Storied Life. This is session 5, and I'm your host, Bob Osborne. In this series, I've been inviting you to pay closer attention to what we are calling our storied life, which really means we're learning to see the details, to recall everything that is going on with us. And we are learning to engage those details, even to tell them. Now, let me make a distinction. I'd like to distinguish between the story we live and the story we tell. So what do I mean? Well, let's suppose we could gather up all of life's happenings, the events, where we went, who we met, how we spent each day, and don't forget the interior happenings, our emotions, our thoughts, our memories. Now, here's what we need to see. All of these happenings will not then automatically become the story we tell. The story we tell will be somewhat different from all that has happened to us. And why is that? Many reasons. Well, first of all, it's impossible for us to completely tell our stories. There's just too much detail. So we have to be selective, of course. We have to catch the threads that give meaning, that explain. But we also need to see that there are, important details we just miss for one reason or another. Or perhaps we don't know how to put what we have experienced into words. And maybe there are pieces of our story that trouble us. We keep those things buried. So telling our stories is harder than we think. There is this wonderfully suggestive moment in the Genesis creation story that I've always loved. When God makes the first human person, and Adam simply means man in the Hebrew, the first human. He sets him in a garden, of course, and he brings to the man various creatures. And here's the interesting little phrase that I've always been intrigued with. God brings those creatures to the man to see what he would name them. In the creation story, God gives the human person this ability to use words, to describe, to connect with what they see, to communicate, to relate. And he waits to hear what the man will say, because it's through the mystery of language, through our words, that we show what we see, that we really reveal ourselves and show what we're connecting to. When I'm with someone in spiritual direction, I often ask them, after they've told some piece of their story, what name would you give to that? How would you describe that emotion, that experience, with a word or with words? Often, it isn't until we find the right word or words, it isn't until we name something or say something that we actually see what we need to see. Okay, now let's take some time to work out the power of words through a couple of stories. And first, a fairy tale by Charles Perrault, the 17th century French writer of some of our best known fairy tales like Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, and many others. And this one is called Diamonds and Toads. So a widow has 2 daughters. The older is disagreeable and proud, but her mother's favorite. The younger is sweet and gentle and beautiful, of course, but she is endlessly abused by her mother and sister for various reasons. And one day, because everything happens one day, do you notice that? The younger daughter is sent to the well to draw water, and there she meets an old woman who asks the younger daughter for a drink. And of course, she is kind and she's good-hearted, and she gives the old woman a drink. Except the old woman was a fairy in disguise. You know how this works in fairy tales, don't you? And she blesses the youngest daughter. And whenever she now speaks, says the fairy, a jewel or a flower is going to drop from her mouth. And so the youngest daughter hurries home to tell her mother what has happened at the well. And as she speaks, jewels and flowers fall from her lips. Well, this is something, isn't it? So the widow sends her oldest daughter, the mean one, back to the well in hopes that she too will meet the old woman there. But this time, the fairy has disguised herself as a beautiful princess. So when the older daughter comes to the well and is looking for the old woman, she is met by this fairy in disguise. And true to her character, she insults her and puts her off because she's looking for someone else to get her reward. And then the fairy reveals herself and says that because of her evil heart, whenever the older daughter speaks, she from then on will, well, a toad or a snake will fall from her lips. So I think we get this. Words are revelations of the heart. Now let me tell you another story with a different angle on the power of words. And this one comes from the novel Larry's Party by Carol Shields, one of our best Canadian writers who's now passed. Shields wants to pay attention to an ordinary Canadian life, and she does this by paying attention to everything that is this ordinary man, Larry. Larry Ordinary, who grows up in Winnipeg. Maybe that's the sort of the quintessential Canadian city. Larry lives through the changes of life, marries and divorces a few times. He pursues a career, and at midlife, he wonders what it's all about. But it was this chapter that Shields called Larry's words that absolutely stunned me when I first read it maybe 20 years ago. Because as Shields tries to pay close attention to Larry, she notices what is most revealing and often overlooked: Larry's words. Of course, Larry uses words like everyone else. He exchanges information. Sometimes he uses vulgarity. For the most part, he evades the deeper questions because of his anxieties. But Shields notices there is something profoundly missing in all these words that Larry speaks. Larry is cut off somehow from the big things, the great things. Shields writes, "There is in the English language a roll call of noble words: nation, honor, achievement, majesty, integrity, righteousness, learning, glory. Larry knows these words, who doesn't, but almost never uses them. These are the words of those anointed beings who take the long view, whereas he lives in the short view. His close-up, textured, parochial world, the little valley of intimacy he was born into, always thinking, always knowing he's thinking, living next door to the great words, but not with them." Now that is a quote worth pondering. We might say that Larry has no words to access a larger picture of life, the grand vision maybe. And I think Shields is showing us something about ourselves and why our words are important, because our words reveal something about us, not just who we are, but what we're deeply connected to, even what we hope for. If ordinary Larry is perplexed, and you can hear that in his vocabulary, then how can that change? Shields says a thought comes into Larry's mind. Perhaps we're waiting, all of us, he thinks, longing to hear something, but not knowing what it is. The power of words. What word or words describe your feelings about life, your hope, your frustration? What do you need to hear? What would you say if you could freely say it? Let me rehearse for us today a Jesus story. This is the story of his interaction with Bartimaeus, found in Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. It's a story about how something really big, in fact, I would say the start of history's biggest happening, will include a poor blind beggar. And even more than that, how the blind man sees it all happen. But it starts with a conversation, which goes to our point about the power of words. So before I rehearse this story, there is a background that should be mentioned. And every story, of course, we know has a background of some kind. Long before The prophet Zechariah had foretold that one day Israel's long-awaited king would suddenly come to Jerusalem. And Zechariah said that when the king did show up, he would come almost in disguise. He could easily be missed. And here's what Zechariah said: "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Zechariah 9:9. Zechariah's words tell us specifically about the biggest of moments. Your king comes to you. So you could imagine in contemporary life something you have waited for all your life, something you deeply depend on and hope for, the biggest thing you can imagine. And now consider that this wait has lasted longer than your lifetime because your whole family tree has been waiting for this moment. And suddenly, the long wait is over. The thing you and all your ancestors have waited for is suddenly here. You certainly don't want to miss that moment, do you? So Zechariah adds one little word that is so important here. The word see. Do you notice that? See, your king comes to you. How do we actually see what we ought to see? What unlocks our seeing? Perhaps the story of Bartimaeus can help us here in a suggestive way, an imaginative way. So imagine with me, a crowd of people are making their way along a dusty road. They are on their way to Jerusalem for Passover. And they are, well, it's a large crowd. They're singing psalms as the pilgrims did. They are loud, they're boisterous, they're happy to be part of the group. And walking with them is someone who has grown quite famous over those past few years. He's this extraordinary figure with this strikingly unique and fearless character, and he carries this intrinsic authority. He's just quite a person. He's known for his teaching and his healing. And of course, I'm talking about Jesus of Nazareth. There was a lot of buzz about him. Was he Israel's promised king? That was the question being bandied about. So this crowd is moving along, and the large crowd of pilgrims passes through the old town of Jericho, and just as they are about to start the last leg of the journey over to Jerusalem, they meet a blind man begging by the side of the road. And the man's name is Bartimaeus. His name literally means son of Timaeus, but the way it sounds could also suggest, as scholars say, son of poverty. Bartimaeus is a poor man. He's a blind beggar. You know, one of the common themes we see in Jesus' stories is how the people on the side, the unimportant or unnoticed, are often drawn into the action. And what we're meant to see here, as we see the story of Bartimaeus, is how the story takes a turn, how Bartimaeus is drawn into the action through an exchange of words. So Bartimaeus is sitting there. He hears that it's Jesus of Nazareth, and he begins to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Bartimaeus just opens his mouth and he bellows out, "Jesus, the rightful king," because that's what son of David here means. "Help me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And the most amazing thing then happens. Jesus stops and says to him, or says, "Call him." And so they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." In the middle of one of the greatest moments in history, one of the most important moments, Jesus, the true king, on his way to a history-defining moment coming to the city. Such weightiness of meaning in that moment. Jesus actually stops. The king stops for a blind beggar, and he calls for Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus hears the call addressed to him. Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and he came to Jesus. Now, one of the common techniques of biblical story is how everything moves along through the medium of conversation. Stories are often told not simply by describing action or movement. Story is often told by recounting words that the characters say. And it's the words of the characters that move the action. So this is interesting. Think about how true this is even with your own life. You will often tell your stories by recalling the conversations you have had. Something like, I said to him, and then he said to me. And we remember the words, especially if the moment is significant to us. This then is how we tell our stories as remembered conversations. In fact, we might even say that our words, the words said to us and the words we say back, are the central happenings in our stories. So now listen to this conversation between the king about to come to a city and the poor blind man sitting on the side of the road. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. The blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. Think of all you have wanted in life. I think of all my wants, all the things I've wanted. One of my first wants was the complete set of hockey cards in 1970. I got that. My wants have changed and grown since then. But it's a really penetrating question, isn't it? If we take it seriously. And if it's the true king who stops to ask us, what do you really want? Bartimaeus wanted to see life in all of the dimensions and significance of what that meant. Bartimaeus wanted to get in on what was truly happening. Go, said Jesus. Your faith has healed you. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. It is now we might remember where Jesus was going. If Bartimaeus followed him on the road, he followed him on that mountain road over to Jerusalem, where one of history's defining moments takes place as the king enters the city. And Bartimaeus, if we read this correctly, saw it all happen. What do you really want, Bartimaeus? What do any of us want? Careful now. Answer wisely and well, because your words will shape your story. Because there is a power in words, a power to unlock meaning and destiny, a power to help us see what the big things are and how we connect to them. In previous sessions, I have invited you to go back into your story and to recall some of the key moments that you should remember. At this time, I think it might be helpful to recall specific moments when an exchange of words seemed to impact you in some way. So, are you able to recall a few of the most meaningful conversations you have had in your life? What was the context? What was said? What did the other person say? What did you say? And maybe you could answer this. Why do you think that conversation has landed so powerfully in your memory? What was it about those words that stuck with you? Now, there's a lot to chew on here, so take your time. And second, consider the quote I gave you from the Carol Shields novel, Larry's Party. The one where Shields says that ordinary Larry was cut off from the big things of life because of the words he never used. I would say go back and freeze the video right there and ponder this quote, because it's really something. Perhaps then we might take some time to consider our vocabulary and how we speak. What do our words tend to reveal about how we see the world? You might need the help of someone who knows you well. What would they say your characteristic speech is? Not just specific words, but also things you tend to talk about. And there is this as well. What new words could you introduce into your everyday speech that might shift your story somehow. Are there any ideas that you have in this regard? And finally, the following is actually a prayer technique. It's called a colloquy, which simply means a conversation, a dialogue. It's a practice that Ignatius of Loyola recommends in his spiritual exercises. Now, I fully realize I'm speaking to an audience that might not all be familiar or comfortable with prayer. Some of you might not be ready to pray, but you might be surprised at what I'll say here, because the idea is simply to enter into a biblical story in an imaginative way, somehow to participate in the story. For instance, in the Bartimaeus story we just rehearsed, we might imagine ourselves as part of the crowd. What do we see? What do we hear? What do we notice? What do we feel? Now, as we follow in our imagination, perhaps a conversation begins with someone. Who are you talking to? What are you saying and hearing? Or we might imagine ourselves as Bartimaeus himself, sitting in the blackness, hearing that Jesus is about to come by. What does that feel like? What words rise up inside of you? Because in the colloquy, we're simply learning to converse with the mysterious other who is there, listening to the ways we sense we are being addressed, listening to our responses, and responding. A colloquy is simply a dialogue which allows a story to live within us in a deeper way. You know, the words that come out of us might be really surprising. Try it. I usually end with a last thought, but today I thought I would simply extend an invitation. I would sincerely like to hear from you. Really, I would. Let me know how these videos are impacting you, what you are discovering about your own storied life, and really anything else that you would like to say or share. You can contact me through my website, which you will see shortly on screen. But until next time, bye for now.